now because I don't want to forget. So get it going straight away.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Cool. And then, yeah, well, that's it. You guys know what's going on. So I'll just disappear and we'll get started on this one straight away, if that's okay.
Cool.
Yeah, just chuck any questions out. If they're relevant at the time, Sam, but if not, save them for the end, it's fine.
Yeah.
Haven't been on this side of it yet.
Hey, so as you're all joining, if you just want to pop in the chat who you are and where you're from, then we'll get started.
Oh, moving slides already.
If you're joining, just introduce yourself in the chat and we'll get started in a second. So, hello and welcome to Learning from the Past, Facilitating Your Committee Handover. I'm Ree and I'm your host for this session. So if you have any issues, just drop me a message using the chat function. As some of you have already, you can use the chat function to introduce yourself and where you're from. A couple of housekeeping notes before I introduce our speaker. This session is being recorded, so just that you're aware. And you can use the Q&A function to submit any questions that you might have throughout the session. There's also a function to upvote a question, so if you see one that you particularly like to see answered, just give it an upvote and I'll make sure we put that one out there. So with that being said, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Callum. Callum got involved with fundraising at Carnival Rag, working at the National Autistic Society once he graduated and moving to Action Against Hunger just over a year ago. So having been through the handover process with Callum at Carnival, I can't think of anyone better placed to give this talk.
Thank you, Ree. That made me feel really old thinking back to like when I must have done my first handover, but you know, come to terms with it. Thanks for joining everyone. As Ree just mentioned, the session is about learning from the past and facilitating your committee handover. It's a topic that I know not everyone thinks is always most exciting, but it's one that I think is really important for any society that you're a part of. Just a quick intro on how the session works. As Ree said, any questions you can use the chat or the Q&A function. And once the session's over, we'll be heading over to the coffee shop. And I'm sure Rhiannon will pop the details of that in the chat at some point as well. But to crack on with the session, in terms of what we're going to go over, I'm firstly going to cover what is a handover and why is it important for any society. Then going to take a look at the stages of an effective handover, how you can make that a real success. Then going to look at the expectation versus reality. There's a model that is the perfect handover where all of the information gets passed between both the incoming and the outgoing committee, but that often isn't the case. And I think especially in light of the current situation we're in with COVID-19 and everyone having to be remote now, the reality is going to be very different. So we're going to look at what that difference is, and then move on to what to do if you haven't had a handover yet. There's a chance that some of you in this session haven't received any information or haven't got all of the information that you want from the outgoing committee. So we'll look at how you can proactively take on board the information from them. So as Rihanna mentioned, I have been involved with student fundraising for 6 years now. So I've been involved with Carnival Rag at the University of Birmingham. I've worked at the National Autistic Society and Action Against Hunger, and had some voluntary positions as well. And the reason I've listed these is because in every single role that I've held, a handover has been really important. Whether that's been receiving a handover when I was on the committee at Carnival Rag, or writing it for the committee who were going to take my place. When I moved into professional employment, I received a handover when I joined the team at the National Autistic Society, and again had to write a handover to give to the person who would be taking on my role once I left. And when I joined at Action Against Hunger and as trustee, I had a handover to come into, which was really, really important to make sure I knew what I was doing in the role, learned from what had been happening previously, and was able to hit the ground running. So I've been through quite a few handover processes now, so hopefully we'll have some good knowledge to pass on to you. And I think this is a really important and relevant quote for this topic. If you don't know where you've come from, you don't know where you're going. And what we mean by that is, whilst obviously the future and your plans you're going to put into place and the actions you're going to take for your year on your committee, your society committee, or more than a year perhaps, is the most important thing. It's really vital that you have contextual knowledge of what's happened in the past, what has and hasn't worked, the people who are going to be really important to helping you make a success of your role. By knowing that kind of historical information, that where you've come from, that's going to make it much easier to go wherever it is you want to go, whether that's raising money, engaging more students, increasing awareness, whatever it is. Having that knowledge of what's gone on previously is really, really important. So what is a handover? So a handover happens when a newly elected committee is prepared for their roles by the outgoing committee, usually combining meetings, written documents and shadowing. As I said, handovers happen in all areas of life, but this is the definition that I've come across when relating to student societies. And as it says, it's about that handover of knowledge between committees, and the way that it's structured is through three main ways. So meetings, whether that's face-to-face or virtual, written documents, and also shadowing. And I'm going to go through all these elements a little bit later on. But essentially the handover is that passing on of knowledge and experience between the outgoing and the incoming committee. But why is the handover important? As I said, I've touched upon some of these already. Firstly, it's about learning from the past and avoiding mistakes that have happened previously. The number of times I've seen committee members or societies come in at the start of their year and then go about making all the same mistakes that happened in the previous year from a committee. Obviously, they're unaware that that's happened previously, but actually a handover process would have made that, would have solved that and made it much, much easier to prevent that happening again. Secondly, for you in your position on committee, it means that yourself in your position, or if you're perhaps a president or a vice president, chair, whatever you want to call it, that you can enable your committee members to hit the ground running by giving them knowledge and the confidence as well to really get started. Importantly, it creates an opportunity to ask questions of the people who've been in your role for the past year. You think the people who you're taking over from, they've been doing your exact role for a year already, perhaps even longer. So they are the best people possible to ask questions about things that you're unsure about, to even get advice or guidance on potential ideas that you've got. They're the best people that you could ask. So that's a really important opportunity that a handover creates. It also accelerates relationships with key contacts, as I said here, such as student union and charity staff. I know a lot of societies can often have difficult relationships with SUs and with potentially staff members that they're responsible to. But that doesn't have to be the case, and a handover is a really good opportunity to kick off the year with a really proactive and beneficial relationship by getting to know that person early, getting them on board with your plans, and that's going to make the rest of your year a really, really successful. And then other key members such as charity staff, again, these are people who are going to have an interest in what you're doing. They're going to want to help you, so make the most of them during that handover. And essentially what all of these points come together to create is the fact that by having a successful handover, your year is going to be the best it could be. You're going to raise as much money as possible, engage as many students, whatever your aims are for the coming year. By having that handover, you're going to make sure that you've got the best possible start. And this is just an example that I've seen happen in real life, just to kind of put all of that into context for you. So say that your incoming treasurer is approached by a reputable local company organising a well-known club night. They want to provide your RAG with £500 sponsorship in return for you promoting their Freshers Week event. It sounds amazing. It's not too much work for you. Maybe it's a bit of social media promotion. Perhaps they want you to do a bit of help with flyering on the night. And actually, you're thinking, great, this is fantastic. You sign up to do it, and then you put in that work. However, if you didn't have that handover, you could be unaware that actually last year, the exact same agreement was made, but the company never honoured their side of the deal. And this would obviously have a lot of implications for your RAG if it were to happen again. That is £500 in sponsorship money that you might have been using to buy vital resources, vital materials for your society. Perhaps you were using that money to even out your bank balance if it had been left in a negative balance the previous year. And by having those funds not come in, then this is going to have a really big impact, not just short term, but long term for your society as well. However, if you'd have had that handover process between the treasurers, both incoming and outgoing, and also more committee members, if you're perhaps again the vice president or the chair, then you could have seen that this was an issue. And it wouldn't necessarily have meant that you couldn't take on this opportunity, but actually you could have put steps in place to mitigate it. You could have perhaps said, well, this is what happened last year. We don't want this to happen again. Actually, we want you to provide half of the money up front before the actual event takes place, and then the other half afterwards. And that's just one example of how having a handover can, as I said, prevent you from repeating mistakes that have been made previously. And in that case, you've then managed to secure that £500 sponsorship that's going to help your society for the rest of the year. So the first question is, who should be involved in your handover? And some of this might be obvious, and we've touched upon it already, but there are some key people. Clearly, you need your incoming committee members. These are the people who need to know that knowledge. They need to be the ones who are absorbing all that information in order to inform what they're going to do for the coming year. In order to give that information, you need the outgoing committee members. They are the experts. They're going to have the information to pass on. And the outgoing committee members is going to be one of the areas that's going to be potentially more difficult, because depending on how involved they've been in the society that year, depends how engaged they're going to be with the handover process. We'll touch upon later how you can engage them. But if you've got someone who's been really involved, then they're going to be willing to hand over that knowledge. But often you're going to have society members, committee members who aren't going to want to engage. Perhaps they haven't done much for their role. Perhaps they just haven't been that involved. The issue here is that they're probably the committee members that you really want to have a handover with, because you want to find out perhaps why a role hasn't gone quite so well this year, perhaps why they've dropped off in their interest in the society, because that could potentially be due to them having issues within their role, whether that's time management, not enough work, not enough resources. So that's really the kind of situations where you want to have that handover, because you want to know what the problems have been previously and build upon that to make sure it doesn't happen in your year on committee. In addition to the committee members, these are obviously the two most important ones. But in addition, as I said, you want those SU staff. Relationships are often difficult between RAGs in particular and student unions. And that's, I think, often just because of the nature of the activities that a RAG often does. They're going to be big, and they're going to be ones that are more risky. But by having your SU staff on board and on board early, you can really build a positive relationship, because these are staff members who want you to succeed. They want to support you in what you can do. But if you don't involve them from the outset, then you're going to make that much more difficult. And then additionally, other key contacts. So I've mentioned charity staff already, but this could also involve people such as companies who offered you sponsorship in the past year. These are key contacts who've got an interest in what you do and an interest in helping you. And if you're able to include these people at some stage of your handover, then it's going to make your year much more successful. So moving on to when your handover should take place. The handover is a process. It's not something that happens immediately, but it should, in an ideal world, begin in the weeks following the new committee taking office, so a couple of weeks after your election or AGM, and then can run for a number of months. It doesn't need to be immediate, and it is often the most successful when it does take a little bit, take a longer period of time. But as I mentioned, don't worry if you haven't received your handover yet. It's not too late to make the most of this process and to facilitate it yourself. So I touched upon this earlier when talking about the definition of a handover, but there are three key stages or three steps. The first being written documents. We're going to go through each of these individually in a moment to talk about what they should contain and how you can make the most of them. But the first stage is a written document. This is really important because it's a kind of a Bible that you can refer to throughout the year. The second stage is shadowing and collaboration. I mentioned earlier that one of the benefits of a handover is that it can increase your committee members' confidence in their role. And that can come between this shadowing and collaboration, a time where you've got two people working together to start putting plans into place for the year. And then once your incoming committee member has developed that confidence and a knowledge of what they're going to be doing, then the outgoing committee member can step back, dust their hands, and leave the new committee member to take over. And then the final stage is meetings. And this kind of runs throughout, to be honest. But having meetings is really important because it gives the opportunity to ask questions, to clarify information, and to really get a sense of what you need to know for the year ahead. So, firstly, looking at the handover document, what should be included? Here I've listed pretty much everything that I could think of. This is what you would get in an ideal handover document. In reality, it's probably not going to have all of these. But again, at the end, we'll go through how you can prioritize what you need to know if you haven't had a handover already. But the first thing is role-specific advice. So obviously, each position on your committee is going to be different. If you're in a RAG and you're a challenge events officer, then you need to know about the tour operators, about the charities. If you organise your RAG week, then you want to know what events have been done previously within that. Perhaps if you've got sponsorship. So that role-specific advice is really, really important. In addition to that, though, if you're a committee member who has additional responsibility, depends what they've been called. When I was on committee, they were called the signatory team, people who have the oversight of the committee, so chair, vice president, secretary, treasurer, then you're going to need some of this included for the positions that you might be responsible for as well. The second thing that should be included is all the admin details that you need, such as logins for emails, social media, because so often I've seen people hand over and then not being able to get into their Facebook page for 6 weeks because the other committee member didn't bother to write it down. So that's a really important point that can save you a lot of time. Links to any useful documents and materials that have been accumulated throughout the year. Minutes of committee meetings and AGMs are really important, often because you're going to have a responsibility with your students' union to log them, but also that can give you a sense of what's happened over the past year. You can get a feel for if decisions have been made previously or discussions that you might be interested in having again. Key contact details, as I mentioned, charity and SU staff. A timeline of what the year looked like for that position or for your society as a whole is really useful because, again, it means you're not starting from scratch. You can build upon that, identify key areas, and it just saves you some workload and allows you to learn from the past. This one, for me, is potentially the most important, alongside the role-specific advice, is a review of events and activities. And that includes both what went well and what didn't. And this is really important because if you're running events year on year, then you want to know what worked well, what managed to raise us lots of money, what engaged the most students. But additionally, what didn't work well, what things would be cut from this year, or what things did we try, it didn't quite work out. But actually, if we adapted it in this way, it could have been really successful. That's the kind of information that's really going to let you build upon your role and really build your RAG or your society year on year. And that then feeds into that advice moving forward. This is something that I was really keen on getting people to do when I was on committee, is every time that you had a thought about what could be done differently, whether it was related to your role or the society more generally, just pop it down in a document. You haven't got to do anything about it, but it means that when you hand over, you can pass that information on and those people then might have time to act upon it. And then finally, any training notes from training activities throughout the year and anything that the outgoing committee member wished they knew 12 months ago when they were sat in your positions taking on the role. Anything that's going to really benefit you. Because as I said, the people you're getting this information from are the people who've been taking on your role previously. So if they can think back and they go, okay, if I knew that I had to talk to this person about sponsorship, or that actually they tried this last year and it flopped, I'm not going to do that, so I might try this idea instead, then that's really going to benefit you. Moving on to the second part of that definition, shadowing and collaboration. Shadowing and collaboration gives the incoming committee member the opportunity to learn on the job and get a feel for the position before flying solo. And as I've mentioned already, importantly, it can also help build confidence. Obviously, this is something that is a bit more difficult if this hasn't happened already. Chances are that you might have already had some of this handover, but not had the opportunity to do this. that does mean that this is more difficult, but there are ways that you can help to get around this. One of the ways is by engaging with your SU staff member. They might have some of the knowledge that you need to help you in this process, or be able to put you in touch with people in a similar position. And also, you can do this between committee members who are incoming. You can kind of set up a skill share where if people have got certain skills and attributes that another committee member might need, then you can pair them up and really get them to work together where possible. But again, we'll touch upon this a bit more at the end when we talk about facilitating your own handover if you haven't had it already. So finally, the third part of that definition is the meetings. Again, the ones you can see here on the screen are what it should look like in an ideal situation. These are all the meetings in an ideal world that you'd have. You'd have a handover meeting with your SU staff member. Again, really important because they're going to be able to give you knowledge about what RAG's tried in the past. And if you've had a staff member who's been there for 5 years, then they're going to have 5 years worth of knowledge and can really help you with that. And they're also going to be people who have knowledge about what's going to be happening moving forwards. Perhaps if your SU is going to be making changes to the way they work, changes such as things from paperwork all the way to kind of what activities you can do on campus, this is a real chance for you to get this information early on and make it a real success. Committee meetings with the outgoing and incoming committee. This is a really, really important one because it gets everybody in one room and it means that everyone can share knowledge. And it means that that's not necessarily limited to just their position. If they've had thoughts on how another committee position or event could be run differently, then anybody can give their input into that. And this is something that if you haven't had it already, you can still do. The third point is having leadership or signatory team meetings. So this is your chair, vice president, treasurer of both the incoming and outgoing committees. Because as I mentioned, often you're going to be responsible for managing the rest of your committee. So what's really important is that you have oversight of what has and hasn't worked well for those positions in the past 12 months. So by having that meeting, you can figure out how to gain that information. But more than just the event-specific knowledge, you can get a handover and information and feedback on the ways that they've managed the society as a whole. So when I was at Birmingham on the signatory team, we had a buddy system where each position who was in that kind of leadership team, as it were. So that for us, that was the president, myself, the vice president and the treasurer. We divvied up the rest of the committee and was responsible for being their point of contact for any queries or questions that they had and making sure that their work got done. So that worked really well for us. But it's important that in that meeting, you can figure out what would work well for you. Perhaps if that hadn't worked well for the following year's committee, if they'd have had a handover, they could have then adapted to a new model that might have worked better for them. The fourth point kind of leads on from those previous two, in the position meetings attended by the relevant leadership or signatory members. So by that, if you've got a communications coordinator, having those incoming and outgoing members meeting, but having the relevant signatory member there, because again, that's going to give you the oversight that you need to make sure that role's a success. And potentially you might have more experience than that incoming committee member. So you can ask some questions that they might not think of. And it just means that there's less opportunities for that knowledge to be lost. And then finally, meetings with key contacts. We've touched upon who those are, but just having those introductory calls, introductory messages are really important, just to make sure that you know who you're going to need to be talking to for what different elements of your society. And to be honest, that doesn't necessarily have to be a meeting every time. That is the ideal situation, but that could just be the outgoing president creating a group chat with a charity staff member and you, the incoming president, just to introduce them. And then you've got that platform to begin that conversation. So as I've mentioned, there's a realistic handover timeline, and there's also going to be one that looks more likely, especially in this COVID-19 situation. And this is just a quick outline of that. I'm not going to go through it completely, but it consists of all of those meetings that we've mentioned. Everybody, sorry, that's the ideal one. Slip slide forward there. This is the ideal one. That those committee meetings will take place. Everyone's going to receive a really comprehensive written guide for their position. The signatory team are going to know exactly what's going on. You're going to meet with all the relevant people. There's going to be some shadowing, and then your handover is going to be complete. But to be honest, I doubt anyone's handover has ever looked like this, especially in the current situation we're in, where terms have been cut short, people can't meet face to face, people have got lots of ongoing problems and issues, and that means that this is just not realistic. And so it's going to look something more like this. You might have attended a committee meeting, but maybe everyone didn't turn up. Some committee members might have received a quick document just outlining some of the information. You met with your outgoing members, but it was for 30 minutes in not an ideal location. And that then leads to you tracking down SU staff members and other key contacts for weeks on end before you actually manage to find the right person. And I'd imagine a lot of you have probably had a handover that looks like this. And this is something that, I mean, it happens every single year, but there are committees up and down the country who don't get the handover they need, or they don't get the handover they were expecting, whether that's at all, or if the outgoing committee tried to do one but just didn't do a good job of it. However, the good news is that you can facilitate your own handover. So, as I mentioned, there were those 3 stages to the handover. So we're going to go through them step by step now to figure out how you can proactively go about making this happen so that you have all the information and the knowledge that you need. So when it comes to written documents, my first piece of advice is to create a shared handover document using something like Google Drive. Having that shared access document where anyone can access it, if you give them the link, is that first step, because you can then share that with your outgoing counterpart. And that means that they haven't got that excuse of they can't set it up. You've done it for them. They've got the link. All they then need to do is to populate the document with the information that you want. But actually, you can go one step further with that. If you haven't had that handover, the likelihood is they're not just going to go there and type down everything that you need to know. They're not going to be bothered to do that. So you can make their life easier by putting down specific information that you want to know. And again, these are some questions that would be useful to ask. What went well and why? What didn't go to plan and why? That helps with that event review that I mentioned before, to get specific feedback on what can be changed moving forwards. What would you improve next year? What do you wish you had known at the beginning of the year? And a list of important contact and login details. If these are the only bits of information that you can get, then this is already a really good place to be starting, because you're figuring out the things to carry on and you're figuring out the things to change. Whilst obviously all that information in between is really valuable and would be really useful, if you just know this information, then you're going to have a much better basis than you had originally to go on. And it means that you can start to implement these changes now. Moving on to shadowing and collaboration. As I said, if this hasn't happened already, it can be difficult to initiate, but there are some steps that you can take. So first of all, it's just asking them to introduce you to key contacts. As I mentioned, that could be popping you in an email, in a Facebook group, whatever it is, and then ask them to join that meeting, even if it's for the first 5 minutes of an hour-long meeting, just to introduce you to the people you're going to be talking to give some context, and then they can leave the call and you can move that relationship forwards. Make sure they send you all the relevant documents. Again, this is something that can be difficult, but if you can manage to track them down for a half an hour chat, then make them do it during that call. Make them send it all to you, make them share passwords with accounts, go through their emails. And that is really going to help you to get a sense for what they've been doing for the past year. If you've got a shared email account that they've been using, go back through their emails, because you can see the sort of conversations that they've had. And that's going to help to inform how you can go about your role as well. And then the final step, which you can use to help this process, is to ask them for feedback on any ideas and plans that you've got. This isn't necessarily shadowing as much. It does come in under collaboration. But actually, I think this one appeals to people who haven't been engaged in that handover process, because you're asking for their opinion and people like to feel valued. Therefore, if you've got an idea and you're saying to them, I really value your opinion, what do you think about this? You're then going to bring that information out because you're asking them to look over an idea, and they're going to be able to use their knowledge of the past year to figure out what they would improve if this was them putting on that event. And again, it appeals to their ego slightly, but that's something that's really going to help you to maintain their engagement. And then the third stage is facilitating your own meetings. Again, these can be difficult to organise, but one benefit of the situation we're in is that everybody is much more comfortable and familiar with using video calls now. Obviously, this whole festival is being held online. So actually, you have got the opportunities to do this, but you do need to prioritise the meetings you're going to have, especially if you're leading your society. So those leadership and signatory handover meetings are going to be really, really important, because again, these are likely to be the people who've been engaged all year. They're going to have that broader sense of what's happened for the past year, and therefore you can tap into that information and get a sense of where you want to lead your society. Those position meetings are really important. Again, if you can facilitate that with a signatory team member, then that's going to be really vital. And also the SU staff handover meeting is really important, and it's going to be the easiest to organise because they're always going to be willing to meet you. That is their job. They're employed and paid to do that. But also if you've got them asking the outgoing committee to do this, that might be another avenue for you to go down, because they might listen to that person slightly more, perhaps because they've had that relationship with them over the past year and they've been on committee. So that can be one that you can use the SU to facilitate for you as well. So I imagine a lot of you have maybe tried some of these steps and actually thinking, what do we do if no one is responding? We've tried to do this and have had no luck. So these are my top tips if you are in that situation. Make it as easy as possible for the outgoing committee. Think about what questions are most important to you, what you most need to know, and that will then limit the amount of asks and requests that you're giving them, and hopefully will lead to them being more likely to respond. Secondly, set up a meeting with your SU. They are going to be really important. As I said, if they've been there for a few years, they're going to have oversight of what's been done. These are the people who've seen your risk assessments, seen all your forms, your paperwork. So they're going to have an idea of what's happened. So they could be really vital in passing on the information as well. Prioritise. So again, this means thinking about what positions is it most important to have a handover for. If you or your leadership team have got any experience in certain positions, then perhaps you can get by without asking more people because you have a knowledge of that. But if there's a position that no one's got any clue about what to do, then that's something where you're going to need that handover to really help inform you. So make the most of that by trying to get a handover for those positions. As I've said already, appeal to their emotion, to their ego. If they aren't responding, encourage them to think about how they would have felt if they entered a position with no handover. And just say that perhaps you're struggling to get this off the ground. Like, we really value your opinion and we want to make sure that everything's going to be a success. Would you please help us just so we can make sure that we aren't in the same position if you had no handover? Or alternatively, perhaps they're not giving you a handover because they didn't receive one themselves. In which case, you can still play on that emotional factor because you can relate that back to them. You can say, I know you didn't get a handover last year, and I'd imagine that made that much more difficult for you. So it'd be really helpful if you could help us to stop that happening this year. Again, you're playing on that emotional side to really make sure that you can get that handover and put your committee in the best possible position. Set clear and agreed deadlines. If you have got people both in your committee, incoming and outgoing, make sure that people know what they need to do and they've got agreed deadlines for that, and follow up on them as well. Once you start letting things slide a little bit, then it becomes much easier for people to forget about it, and ultimately you'll be in September and you won't know who's had a handover and who hasn't. Be persistent. I think I've kind of touched upon that throughout, but you really want to make sure that you have this information so that your year is a success. So be persistent, be shameless, keep asking them. In reality, if they're no longer on committee, they're either not interested in society anymore, or they're going to be graduating. So what that means is you haven't necessarily going to have the opportunity to come across them again. So if you are coming across as a bit annoying, or then that doesn't really matter, because you might not have any further interaction. And in my opinion, it's worth being persistent and even annoying, because that then means that you're going to get that information that's going to make your year a success. And then finally, you can find workarounds as well. So by that, I mean speaking to other people who are still involved, whether that's people who aren't on committee but have been involved for a few years, other staff members, whoever is involved with your society that you know was around for the last year. Have a chat with them to see what they know, what they think could be improved. And that, again, is going to be a good source of information to make the most of your year.
Can I just give you a question?
Yeah, go for it.
So Neve has asked, what happens if certain board members are reluctant or actively against helping new committee with handovers?
So that's a really good question. I think that is one that is relatively regular. And I think with that one, I think for me, you need to appeal to, I think there's two sides of this really. So there's kind of the logic and the emotion. The logic is, I think, as you said, they're board members, but whoever it is, to be honest, they're going to have some sort of investment in the society, in the committee, and the officers, whatever it might be. And therefore, they want the best for that organisation, whatever form it's in. So therefore, it makes logical sense that there is a handover period to make sure that whatever organisation it is can grow and continue to be more successful. And ultimately, if it is a board member, I'm assuming you might mean like a kind of who come in at the officer, the sabbatical officer level, then that's their responsibility to put that group of people in the best position possible. So they have that responsibility, and I think it's worth reminding them. But on the flip side, there is that emotional side as well. If they are against it, let them know that actually, if you're someone coming into a position, whatever position it is in life, and you haven't got any prior knowledge and no information about how to begin your role, that's really difficult. And again, you can relate that back to them and kind of say, okay, if you were in this position and you hadn't had any knowledge, you didn't really know where to begin, what would you expect? They're going to want to have that information. So I think using that side of it's going to be really important. And if you then combine that as well with talking to people who are around, then that's really going to help you to formulate that. And to be honest, whilst a formal handover process is obviously the ideal situation, you can do this informal one just by going for a coffee with someone or having a quick video call. If they still don't respond to that, and it can be about formulating that yourself. So I hope that kind of helps to put that in that perspective there. Any more questions, Rio? Or do you want me to carry on?
That's it for the minute.
Cool, fantastic. So they were the tops to do if no one was responding to your kind of handover process. In terms of how that might look different in the current situation relating to COVID-19, again, we've mentioned some of these already, but video calls are easier now than they ever have been. People are much more familiar with it. People are used to the technology. So set them up. In previous years, I know if I'd have tried to set up a video call with an outgoing committee member over summer when I hadn't spoken to them for a while, it might have come across a bit weird. That's not necessarily the case anymore. So make use of that. Start the process ASAP if it hasn't happened already. Start it tomorrow. Get that first message in and just say, look, I know we haven't done this yet, but I'd be really, really grateful if you could spare me some time to go through how you found the year, what you'd improve, and just get that ball rolling. I think it's important to identify the key issues that you're going to be facing. So one example is being that online first term, which can look very different for everyone. So develop a list of questions to ask in your handover process that you think are going to help you to overcome that might be based on previous knowledge. So for example, if you're going to have to move in all of your society's events online because students aren't going to be there in person, ask your committee if they've tried to do this before for maybe 1 or 2 events. Figure out if they have. Alternatively, if they haven't, ask them about the group of students that you're going to be trying to engage. Ask them what they think the key barriers are for them to get involved in these events. And I think that will then help you to guide that handover process to overcome these barriers that are honestly going to be greater than we've seen in previous years, just due to the current circumstance we all find ourselves in. Speak to student union ASAP. I've said this already. They're going to be really key. Just do it. Find out who you need to get in touch with, and get that ball rolling as well. And set those clear deadlines and responsibilities. Make sure that you know who's going to be following up with which committee members, what information you need to know. Set deadlines. Make sure everybody knows them, and then you can work to them to really make sure that your handover process is smooth, and that all the tasks happen, and that you can have that really really informative handover process to put yourself in the best possible position. So my final slide is kind of a follow-on, and for many of you this might seem like a fair stretch away, but I think it's really important and really successful for societies if you can embed that handover culture in your RAG, but also this works for any other society. And I think there's a few steps you can do. The first is to store all documents in a shared space, and Google Suite is perfect for that. Using Google Drive to share your documents, because that means anyone who comes into that position will inherit the email and the folders where everything is stored. And that means that at any point they can go back through it, they can search a certain word, and they can find out what's happened previously. And this means that you don't lose files in people's inboxes, that you don't have people saving things to their own laptops and it's lost forever. And that really helps to embed that process. Start it early, and this doesn't mean now, but at any point throughout the year when you're planning events or campaigns or whatever it might be, just make a quick note on what worked really well and what hasn't gone to plan. And then when it comes to the end of the year, that's going to remind you what that was, and then you can use that to formulate the handover that you're going to give to your next committee. And I think finally, make it clear to your committee that this is part of their roles, and ensure that they complete it immediately after your AGM or election next time round. this is often part of constitutionally what a committee member has to do. Therefore, they are accountable for it. And I think reminding them that this is something they're going to have to do is then something that really helps to make this part of your handover culture within your RAG. And you might think that's great, but why does this benefit me? But ultimately, the successful handover not only helps the new committee, but it creates a legacy for the work that you've put in. If you've had a record-breaking year, that's fantastic, and you can take all the applause for that. But actually, by sharing that information to the next committee, that then means that they can have a record-breaking year again, and that means more money raised for amazing causes, more students engaged across campus, and that year-on-year growth is something that could start now by you just implementing this really simple process. So I think that's a really good motivation and something that will then outlive you for years to come, and will leave your society in the best position possible. So that's me done. I hope that's been useful. I don't know if we've got any questions, Roo?
Yeah, thank you. That was a really useful talk. We've got one question at the minute.
Stop sharing my screen now.
How do you get the balance right between advising incoming members on what to do based on your experience, but still allowing them to put their own spin on things and giving them freedom in their new role?
I think that's a really good question, and I think it's one that I know from personal experience I've struggled with as a society member, as a committee member, sorry, who has been in that position where you've got past experience and you've got new people coming into the role, and that balance is difficult to come by. And I think in my experience, the way to do that is at that beginning point of the year is to try and give that committee member all of the knowledge that they need to know, all of the kind of the resources that they want, pass it over to them, make sure that they've got it, give them that chance to ask questions. And then once they've got that information, and that's not you telling them what to do, that's just you passing on what's worked well previously, what hasn't, and try not to make it potentially leading. But by giving them that information, you're then putting them in the best position possible to then go about their role. And obviously, as I mentioned, that kind of shadowing and collaboration is important. But as someone who is going to be overseeing those positions, you can really make that process led by them with you in that kind of advisory position. And I think that comes into kind of the culture of within your committee as well, where you create an environment where people know they can come to you with questions or use you as a sounding board for ideas. And actually you can then help to inform those decisions, but ultimately it is that committee member's responsibility to make those decisions. Obviously, if you are there as a leader of the committee, you have a responsibility if something's going to really negatively affect you. So if you're going to lose thousands of pounds, or if it's going to give you a bad reputation, then you have the authority at that point to step in. But actually your remit is to guide them, and they are there to organise that event or to run that activity. So I think creating that environment where you give them all of the information, the resources they need, and then kind of let them go with it, but they know they can come to you, is the way to really balance that.
Yeah, definitely. If anyone has any other questions, just pop them in the Q&A box. Otherwise, we can move over to the coffee shop if anybody wants to talk about something more general. I don't think there are any more questions. The link for the coffee shop is in the chat. It's table 1. It's also on the website where you joined this one for.
Thank you very much for coming, everyone. I said, yeah, we'll be in the coffee shop if anyone wants to have a further chat.
Cool.
Oh, I need a drink after that. Water, I must add, just for the throat.
There we go. The link's in the